Yes.
Fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you are in the world. As Saraj mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about real-time communications. I'm based in the UK. And really what we want to focus on tonight is a little bit more around some of the challenges that we're having in the world when it comes to energy transition. So again, here's just my credentials very quickly. I've got over 25 years in technology, 5 years in power utility, 10 years in energy overall, and I've had the fortunate luck of being actually in multiple countries and geographies. So we'll talk a little bit more around some of what's happening in those countries. And then the last thing I'll mention is I'm currently pursuing my master's in energy policy. So if there's a business and a policy slant to what we talk about tonight, there's a good reason behind that. So the energy transition is really in full swing when we start looking at some of the different policies that are in place and some of the different international policy examples I have on the slides here. We can definitely see that the future of the industry, or what we are seeing already, is renewable. It is very competitive and liberated when we look at the different market structures. We're seeing a lot of highly distributed and local generation and investments. We'll talk more about that as a focus area. It's also very dynamic, and we all understand that being in this industry and what we're focusing on at UNIFI. And also the multi-act or multi-market, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about. So what I'd like to really focus on here on the slide is some of these international examples and the dates on these. So when you look at Europe, there was the EU 2019-948 initiative actually started opening up this market to anyone who had excess capacity to be able to sell on the open market. Australia is also very active with these liberalization of markets and looking at peer-to-peer interactions and a lot more renewable investment coming from the private sector. In Japan, the Renewable Energy Act of 2020, which was an amendment for them, actually created an interesting, essentially a very interesting dynamic for them, where they eventually removed all energy retailers and created a digital platform specifically around trading. So every consumer had a direct market interaction with generators, which I found very interesting. And then lastly, here where I'm sitting in the United Kingdom, we've had multiple programs and multiple market renovations, so to speak, over the last few years, but we'll focus a little bit on the feed-in tariff from 2019 and the Flex Innovation Program and the changes there. Now, these policies are really key, and they're resulting in a lot of economic changes as well. So we see a lot of new business models, we see a lot of funding, and there's been a large shift again from large centralized generation to a combination of those large centralized and also small localized generation assets. And while this all looks very positive up front, it's really not without a tremendous number of issues. And one of those is the fact that in renewable generation investment has actually outstripped and outpaced grid investment. What they're seeing now is that digitalization is definitely a key enabler in how we are going to operate the grid in the future. The last thing I would mention is that innovation funding is extremely high in all of these countries. However, what I'm seeing and the trend I'm seeing is that although the innovation funding is very steep, there is a hurdle moving from innovation to business as usual. And that's going to continue, I think, to be a problem moving in the future. As we look, the US is following suit, but I believe it's much more slowly. If you look at FERC Directive 2222, I think the interpretation and implementation is still in its infancy. And while many policies and subsidies do exist, and when I started looking through some of these different state initiatives, some of them have upward of 100 different initiatives in this area. The market is still very fragmented, and obviously with multiple independent system operators and multiple markets and regional transmission operators, it makes it a bit more difficult as a vendor to come into this space with one solution. And I think that that's really holding the US back from really embracing FERC Directive 2222 and some of the other renewable initiatives that could happen. There's far fewer tariffs, feed-in tariffs. In fact, only 7 states offer feed-in tariffs as of December 2023. And I think that also inhibits private investment from a consumer perspective into solar plus storage for their own benefit as well as for feeding into the market. I think when you look at the norm, utility grade assets are still the norm, and lower energy prices actually also hinder the private and consumer renewable investment asset. There may be parts of the country that, like in California, that may not be as true, but overall, I think that we see that the US is still going to be a little bit slower in its adoption. So again, I'm going to shift back a little bit to my international background, and renewable investment obviously is moving fast. There's a lot of investment happening in the generation perspective, but it's also creating a number of challenges. And this is probably nothing new for anyone on the call, but just to level set some of the market volatility that we're seeing, as well as an increased queue for the interconnects. And what's in here in the UK, some of these interconnection queues are as long as 8 years in locations. It's also creating a lot of grid instability. We're now seeing reports in Europe, certain countries in Europe, that are essentially shutting down any EV charging operation between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. because the grid cannot sustain the level of power it's required for all the EVs that are now on the road in this country. And also it's creating high curtailment costs. When you look at the wind curtailment monitor in UK in 2022, these two numbers that you see here, it costs consumers £215 million to turn wind farms off. And then another 717 million to essentially replace that generation with gas-fired power to make up the difference in the lost generation. So I think that it's really something that we need to be aware of. And I think it is really creating an interesting dynamic and opening up the market for, or opening up really the industry for flexibility. And that's really what we're going to talk a lot about, is this flexibility platform and what we mean by orchestration and real-time compute. So when we talk about flexibility, demand response tariffs have largely been unsuccessful. In 2022, only 5% of the eligible consumers actually participated in the flexibility market in the UK, which led the government and the regulator to really consider what to do to enable that, more participation and increase that incentive. So in 2023, the UK actually created a multi-tiered flexibility market where the TSO and the DSO both tender for their own flexibility, and they're both bidding requirements out to local businesses for demand side flexibility. It makes it a little interesting, I think, as they now compete for those same customers. It's really an insurance policy, obviously, for them, for the grid operators, but it also provides the necessary commitment to the flexibility that they need when they need it and where they need it. If you look here, it's really interesting to see the amount of capacity that they did procure last year, which is a record amount. But again, we know that that's not enough when we start looking at what the future may bring. And essentially, the role of the DSO is becoming increasingly important in this idea of the flexibility, largely because these entities are connected at the distribution network level, as well as we are looking at a lot more renewable energy investment that's happening in the distribution network. And so that's creating this new role really for the DSO to come in and play in this space. I think it's really interesting to think about what opportunities now exist from a distributed flexibility perspective. And so when we look at this in the past, again, we've had very little, I guess, flexibility when it comes to maybe some shifting of loads. If you've got a heat pump possibility, if you've got some water heaters that you want to shift that demand a little bit. And really, it's not been as successful, again, as was mentioned with the demand response tariffs. Most consumers won't go out of their way to curb their demand when the grid operator needs it because of the cost. The cost of inconvenience really outweighs the incentive put forth by the retailers or by the grid operators. But this new bifurcated flexibility market that we're seeing in the UK and upcoming in Europe is actually creating a new wave of investment potential for private residential and commercial entities, manufacturers, storage providers, and private-public partnerships. And so what we're seeing really is an increase for one reason or another, whether it's a decarbonization from an EV charging perspective or the electrification of heat, which obviously is a large demand right now in Europe, multiple countries in Europe, as well as the UK. Or we're looking at the high cost that we experience here in the UK and Europe for electricity. That's really making these companies step back and say, what more can I do to curb my OpEx, and what opportunities do I have? So we now see a larger investment in these renewable assets. We're seeing difference in behaviors as well as in the digital platforms that are required to essentially optimize this energy, plan for that, and then to operate it. And so I think we'll continue to see what that looks like, and we'll see more benefits coming from that as we move into the future. Now, I think we also need to recognize that some of these commercial entities are actually looking at a way to utilize investments they are currently making in backup generation or, again, storage for their own OpEx. They're looking at new ways to modify their investment and to increase that a little bit and create this dual purpose asset where they not only have the energy security, so if there is an outage, that they have the ability to utilize that for their own purposes, but also, again, to build into a new revenue stream into the markets by utilizing and stacking, so to speak, the flexibility markets, the local constraint markets that are upcoming, and even some of the frequency markets that are available to them if they meet the requirements technically. So I do think that it's really becoming, and I'm having a lot more conversations with different types of commercial and industrial entities that are wanting to take advantage of this. So if we think about, as the grid evolves, the digital infrastructure necessary to run the grid is also going to need to evolve. We're looking at more data points. We're looking at more entry points overall. We're looking at different types of data. We're looking at the collection intervals of that data shrinking. We're looking at market closing intervals. Now we've gone from 15-minute closings. There's conversation here to 5-minute closings on some of these markets. And we're also looking at requirements for this data at the very edge of the network needing to flow either from peer to peer or from the low voltage network all the way into the high voltage network. In conversations I've had with the ESO here in the UK, I know that is a concern of theirs, is having that visibility into the lower levels of the network and how they're going to understand what's happening there. As well, I think automation is going to have to increase. A lot of our scheduling and dispatch is still done manually for certain things. I think that that's going to have to change given the number of assets that we're going to be looking at connecting and the amount of dynamicity of the network when we talk about EV charging, vehicle to grid, and all those types of things, especially as we go into heat pump and electrification feed as well. There's going to be so many different assets that need to be monitored and controlled and steered in some way. The manual activation for demand response, or that binary reaction, whether it's on or off, when we talk about feed-in tariffs, that will become a thing of the past. We'll have to find new ways of managing these assets to take advantage of them. So presently, the optimization is really behind the meter flexibility. It's really what we see the most of. Let's make sure I was hoping my animations will work. We see a lot of the behind the meter happening where you may have a controller with solar plus storage, or you may have an EV and perhaps shiftable loads within the home. And they may be managed by a single controller, or you may have multiple apps that are managing these and really creating somewhat of a headache, I think, for the consumers. Oftentimes, there may be multiple ways that they can configure their home and their EV charger or their car that may be in conflict with each other and really creates a less than ideal scenario when it comes to the operation of those assets, as well as the cost savings to the consumers. But really, ultimately, this right now is what we're seeing the most of, is just the behind the meter flexibility optimization. When you start looking at how you can create a new reality with this, the future, while we still have these pockets of optimization behind the meter, what we're going to start seeing are portfolio groupings based on economic, geographic, asset type, potential renewability, or even technical objectives. And so now you have these new roles of flexibility service providers, demand side flexibility aggregation operators, virtual power plant operators that are now coming in and looking at their asset portfolio and deciding that they may want to create synergies between certain parts of their assets, whether again it's economic or maybe it's the way that they can address the renewable desires of their actual customer base. And so now we're looking at this idea of this multi-hierarchical balancing with orchestration. So rather than doing the binary on or off the feed-in tariffs, maybe we'll start massaging between not only in the home, between their whatever generation they may have, their storage and their load shifting to balance that individual home. But now we're looking at sharing that responsibility or sharing that benefit across multiple households, or in the case of some situations here in the UK, we see what we call energy communities, where local authorities or villages are actually building local assets, and it's oftentimes crowdsourcing the funding of these to not only decarbonize their own footprint in that area, but also offer these new economic rewards to their customers, whether it's a lower cost of their energy, or it's again energy security. As we look through the grid and what that means is now we can create this hierarchical situation where we have levels of optimization, and it helps, although it does make a more complexity in the grid and the operation of that, we actually can start looking at harmonizing some of these competing objectives. And so this is the idea of balancing from that perspective, but utilizing small changes rather than just the binary on off to make that happen. And so again, using edge compute and looking at these as orchestration nodes along the network, you can start making better decisions in real time on how those assets need to operate, need to behave. So when we look at orchestration at a glance, what are we talking about really? So we're talking about a technology, the stream processing technology. And for us here in my team, it was based on a Bell Labs technology that was essentially developed to utilize stream processing to analyze video streams. And it's, when you think about what a video stream really is, it's really similar to how we're looking at the grid operating. Essentially, it was a one-way video stream. It's being delivered one direction, analyzing that in real time, although video obviously is less, how do I say it? It's less susceptible to interference or less susceptible to losses. You can tolerate those losses more easily. We really need to look at the amount of data that we were analyzing. And so we started developing this at the edge. So the video stream, which tends to be quite robust, was kept at the edge and not impacting the network in the backhaul. So streaming processing benefits really allows for that optimization on the fly in real time. You're not keeping the data and storing that data to analyze it. You're actually doing it while it's streaming. It decreases that need for centrally stored data. And that's kind of a caveat I understand for power utilities, especially when it comes to keeping data for historical purposes and going back if there's, a report for compliance or report to the regulator. But it also can increase the security through event isolation. Now, I've got a caveat on that because in some ways that is somewhat theoretical. But I think that when we talk about being able to isolate this stream and not pulling it all the way back to a central location, and if in a sense you're containing that event to that one local area, and it's also much more difficult to essentially inject into that stream something that we may not be looking for if you're using things like zero trust technology. And that will be an underlying technology, I think, to this idea of really securing the number of points that we have there and the number of streams. It also, as I mentioned, decreases the impact on the communication backhaul. when you start looking at what the costs are for backhaul and compute, there's a balance that has to be considered between the cost of fiber for backhaul and where do you end that fiber. And we'll talk about some of those options in a few moments. But I really want to think about how you can keep most of this at the edge and what that edge strategy would mean for a power utility or for an energy retailer, and how that's going to impact their decisions about what type of communications technologies they need to be looking at. And again, we're always trying to look forward and seeing what we can do better and how we need to change the operation, and from a digital perspective, as well as if there are new ways to look at system operation on the grid. Now, as we mentioned, the hierarchical approach benefits, and I know this may be a little bit of a paradigm shift for those of you on the phone or on the call that thinking about how we do system operation now and what those challenges are. And I will say that this is not necessarily a perfect scenario. There are going to be changes. There are going to be challenges as we go down the road. But I think creating those bite-sized chunks in order to process that faster. So even though our data, when you think about SCADA data, it's very small amounts of data, but it needs to happen in closer to real time. When we think about trying to pull back the number of data streams to a local, even to a centralized location, and then processing that, making some decisions, and then pushing it back out, we still are looking at a number of different challenges with outages, potentially outages somewhere in the core, or how we create those streams and redundancy in those streams to make sure that all works properly. So I really think that breaking it down to the math and breaking it down into these bite-sized chunks where we can harmonize and balance in these local areas first will really help with that processing of the data and being able to make a decision, an automated decision, and act upon that decision and close to real time. It harmonizes with downstream constraints and the objectives. And I think, again, this is something really to keep in mind, as our prosumers are now very knowledgeable. And in some ways, they can be quite demanding when they look at the cost of their energy, when they look at how they want to choose how to invest, and they want to be able to have a hand in decarbonization. Then I see that many of them, especially the Gen Z and those who are becoming those future investors, are very willing to spend a little bit more on decarbonized or sustainability, and they're really pushing brands to become and to hold their feet to the fire, so to speak, to make sure that they are doing what they say they're doing, and that they take sustainability seriously. So I think that those types of prosumers where they want to be green, that may not always coincide with the objective of the grid operator or of the retailer who's looking for the lowest cost energy. And so how do you harmonize all of those different objectives and those constraints? Perhaps there's an outage somewhere in the grid and that you can't deliver the type of energy that consumer is asking for. Do they know when they flip the light on that that's coming from the wind farm that's down the road, or if it's coming from a nuclear power plant that's in 2 states away? No, they don't. But I think that the expectation and what we're seeing happening in the European Union is that PPAs are no longer going to be, I should say financial PPAs are no longer going to be acceptable. And there is a push to go towards this traceable green energy. If you are going to claim to be carbon neutral or to claim to be net zero, then you have to prove not only through a financial PPA and be green on the books, but actually be able to prove where your energy is coming from. And I think that is a requirement that's coming down the road, not that far away. And so it does have a lot of people talking about how do we address that type of a scenario. I do believe that our consumers will be looking for that. But again, how do you maintain the resiliency of the grid and still try to harmonize these downstream constraints and objectives? Well, I think this hierarchical approach will help to do that. The scalability issues, as we look at, again, the vehicle to grid, if we look at the number of different assets that are intelligent and can be steered, even the appliances within the home that now are intelligent, have Wi-Fi connectivity and can be managed, it's looking at a high number of assets and data points that need to be, again, monitored and collected and somehow analyzed and acted upon in order to help create, a lower consumption curve during those times of peak consumption. This hyperloop approach also enables the upstream sharing of the aggregated data. As I mentioned, here in the UK, the ESO is looking to have visibility into the lower voltage network, and how that works here is going to be a little bit different perhaps than how it works in the US, depending on the nature of the actual entity of the power operator. Here in Europe and in the UK, oftentimes they are completely separate entities, and that data sharing may not happen the same way that it does in the US. Coming from a US power utility, I'm quite familiar with how some of the different protocols there have worked to share that information. But again, the type of information we share, whether it has to be the raw information or whether it's aggregated information and aggregated data from the lower voltage levels of the network, remains to be seen. But I do foresee that the information is going to have to be limited. It's going to have to be the analyzed or transformed data at the edge that will be sent upstream, because otherwise it's just too much data for them to handle or to do anything with. And again, it helps reduce the amount of data that's transmitted and stored, which also actually increases the sustainability of the solution itself. So as we talk about, building an edge compute strategy, what does that really mean? And what do we need to be aware of from a power utility perspective, especially? And what is that? What are the caveats or the best practices around that? So these are a little bit of my opinion, a little bit of what I'm seeing as I'm talking to our customers, and again, working at Nokia and looking at a cloud strategy overall. It's one of those where an internal cloud strategy, while cloud still seems to be somewhat of a word that no one wants to embrace just yet in the operations space for power utilities, understandably so. I think we need to just delineate what's cloud as in internet and public cloud, and what really it means to have a virtualized environment, and what that edge compute looks like. So really, first and foremost, we need to ensure that digital is part of the overall strategy. I think this is something that we've been seeing for a while in the industry, but it's really going to be very necessary moving forward. And while we still have been embracing digital in certain aspects, I think the overall compute strategy really needs to be at the heart of moving forward what we look for. We need to be able to plan physical redundancy according to the resiliency needs. In the diagram I showed in the previous slide, we talked about where do those orchestration nodes sit. And one of the beauties of what we can do is when you start looking at physical versus logical type of operation and nodes, we can create a resiliency based on and with physical assets based on where the needs are for the grid, and not necessarily where at every location. And I think that flexibility does help when it comes to the maintenance side aspect of this type of a strategy. We have to consider the communication options when we think about edge compute. Again, from a resiliency perspective, some of the locations that we may have out in the remote regions of the grid, while they may not dictate or require necessarily physical resiliency, redundancy from a perspective of the amount of energy that we're in the power that we have in those locations, or the customer base that we have there, because we may not have the best backhaul, but we do have a robust field area network. We can look at creating resiliency with the node there so it can operate in islanded mode, or in the situation where we may have a lot of wind, or we may have fires that we need to be able to isolate and let that part of the grid run in a way that can be disconnected from the rest of the grid. Also, creating multi-purpose containerized services. When we talk about the actual physical devices, looking at sharing that space and those containerized virtualization environments with other potential systems that are necessary in the grid operation or for operations overall, corporate operations as well. that's a wonderful idea to have one particular device that's there that serves multiple purposes. However, we have to be mindful of compute prioritization needs and make sure that those software applications that need compute and are priority applications are definitely prioritized in that system somehow. And then again, I think standardizing the protocols and the designs when possible, obviously, is always something that we would need to look for. However, I think what we really want to think about with that is, again, I can't be someone who works for Nokia without mentioning communication options in the DSO and what options they have. So when we break the network down into 4 different areas, there are multiple technologies that can really serve purposes in multiple segments of the network, but not all of them are practical. And I have to say, in my 20+ years of being in communications, telecommunications, there's always a combination. There's always a hardwire somewhere. We typically never have wireless all the way back from the low voltage all the way to the central location. And so we need to look at the combination. And again, this may be budget driven, it may be capacity driven, but we need to look and see what makes sense in those particular areas. Here, optical, obviously, whether it's dark fiber, WDM, or some sort of PON technology, it all plays a part somewhere. Passive optical network, typically not in the backhaul, although it can be in the aggregation. Dark fiber, we've seen, pretty much across the board to the field area network in some situations, but it's not always practical if you have a very large geographic expanse of your grid. If you are a municipality or co-op with a limited footprint, it makes more sense. However, dark fiber into the home area network really isn't practical at all. Microwave, again, it's really good in certain situations where you may have terrain issues, but it reaches almost to the field area network. It might be a little impractical there, but that's when you start looking at some of these other cellular and wireless technologies and where they sit. So again, it's always going to be a combination. It's always going to be some sort of, budget driven possibly, and it's always dependent upon things like your frequency coverage, what's really stable technology, and really what the bandwidth needs and the redundancy needs for your network are. Keeping the lights on, we still have challenges amidst all of these things. Digital technologies do a lot of different things. They are really helpful and can enable a lot. However, I think in this scenario, when we talk about flexibility, we talk about multi-hierarchical orchestration and all of the new system operation challenges that we have, or the needs that we have. There's a lot that still needs to happen, especially as we talk about the US and things that are happening here from a regulatory standpoint. I think here policy and regulation is probably one of the key elements. Not only is it budget and earmarked budget for innovation and investment into these technologies, but also ownership of data. Who has access to the data? Where does that data reside? How long do we need to keep our data? What type of data do we have access to, etc.? I think cybersecurity is quite self-explanatory. We haven't solved all of that, but there are new technologies coming out that will enable it. Inter-industry collaboration. I'm really keen on this one. And the reason I say this is because when we look at telecommunications service providers, oftentimes they have real estate at central offices, and they are also geographically very dispersed. And so they makes a natural partnering or a natural convergence for them to look at energy, which is ironic because we've seen a lot of power utilities, municipalities going into broadband and offering telecommunication services. And now what I'm seeing is a trend where many communication service providers are now partnering and stepping into the energy space. We can talk a lot more about that, but I'm cognizant of time. That will go anywhere across the spectrum, from providing retail services through an energy partner and becoming an energy retailer, to an independent power producer, or essentially creating subsidiary companies and having direct market access where they're their own balancing responsible parties. So we see a little bit of everything happening there, and there's a lot of interest in what more they can do to serve not only their consumers that they have as telecommunications customers, but also how to provide what they call stickiness and what services can they provide to help create a better relationship with those consumers to keep them as consumers. The maintenance, I think, is going to be is still a large challenge. How do we automate some of the maintenance? How do we automate and make sure that our truck rolls are not out of hand? How do we create remote capabilities and remote scripting in order to take care of some of those nuances? And then also data standardization. There's a lot of work in Europe going on around data standardization between both the transmission and the distribution system operators. I believe that they've agreed to look at the SIM standards for both. Transmission obviously has adopted those already, but they are looking at ways to standardize that data transfer so it makes it easier for them to share that data. And again, as I mentioned, ownership. If you look at some of the regulation around who can own, what entities can own generation assets and what entities can own storage, that might make a difference. We do see some power utilities or grid operators looking at new revenue streams that are outside the regulated business. Even in Germany, I've spoken to a few where they are providing and leasing assets, heat pumps, water heaters as a service. So they maintain ownership of that device, but they actually utilize the flexibility in that asset for their own purposes, and they give it to the consumer at a lower cost. And so there's some interesting dynamics and again, some innovative business models coming from some of the opportunities there. Pervasive communication, I think, speaks for itself. Protocol maturity adoption is another one, I think, where we are looking at a journey to that, what types of protocols we're looking for, whether we're looking at IEC 61850, whether we're looking at open ADR or other standards that are out there, and how those mature and how far and how pervasively adopted they are I think it still remains to be seen. And lastly, the data retention requirements we've spoken about. I think that that's really going to still play a part in what type of data and how well we can utilize the streaming protocol and what type of data is transformed and where that needs to be stored for what purposes. So I think overall, we still have a lot of challenges that we have to address. But I hope that this gives you a little bit of an understanding around what orchestration looks like from a flexibility management perspective, and really provokes your thoughts around how can we continue to think about these challenges and perhaps address some of these in the future. So I think that's all I have. So Raj, if we'd like to end the recording, we can start with the conversation.